I work in a Peruvian NGO called Law Environment Natural Resources. In Peru, we work in the Amazon rainforest, and then, I don't know, maybe in the last 10 years, we follow the Chinese investment, supporting the local communities that can affect with these operations.
No,
So,
yo de-
right.
despacito he conocido mucha gente, me invitan a que vaya a clase,
Right.
son de gratis, si no es de gratis yo no voy. Otras son Zoom,
¿Alguien tiene,
otras son workshop,
alguien tiene
y
prendido su
entonces
micrófono?
tengo
Si
un
puede
Zoom
apagarlo,
ahí de 9 de la mañana a
please.
4 de la tarde. Sí,
Marín,
y yo pensé que iba a ser duro,
Marín,
pero no, gracias a Dios.
Marín.
Ya no, ellos empezaron a las 9, pero yo estaba en tránsito. Y entonces,
Eddie, ¿puedes
no,
apagar tu
se
micro?
supone que tú, es una clase regular, no te toleran que tú llegues tarde.
Pueden apagar su
Yo,
micro. Marín, Eddie. Okay. I think okay. So, okay, we can start the session. We have three speakers. This session, climate change, environmental protection, and how to link with Chinese environmental policy, Chinese investments. At least we can see a collaborative agenda to work in these issues at the end of the session. Maybe this is the goal of this session. And the idea is how to touch at least some key issues about the Chinese presence and in Africa and Latin America region, thinking the environmental impacts or climate consequence of this presence of China in our regions. So we have three speakers. Mónica, we are going to start with Mónica's Nuñez Salas. She's a human environment geographer. She's currently a PhD candidate at the Department of Geography, Environmental Society, University of Minnesota, United States. Her work focuses on how China and Latin America cooperation transforms legal, political, and environmental landscapes. Well, she's from Peru also. She has a Master of Environmental Management from the University of Yale and a law degree from Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. She have a previous compromise. So, Monica, you can start, take the time that you need. At least I hope that we can some time to ask questions or comments to your presentation. Please go ahead.
Gracias, Cesar. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And apologies in advance that I do have a teaching commitment right after, so I may not be able to stay and enjoy the discussion with Valerie and Kennedy. My name is Monica. I am a legal geographer. I come from law, and I'm thinking about geography, and I'm thinking about different ways of relating. So those are the thoughts that I'm going to try to share with you today. So I'll try to start maybe thinking about method first, thinking about transnationalism, regionalism, and ways of approaching knowledge. And then I'm going to try to guide us to think about what, like some discussions that I've been a part of, like what a third world agenda might look like. And maybe how can we focus on relations and contradictions, especially within our countries, to try to find different ways of approaching and different methods and kind of like start from there. So yeah, so I guess I started saying I'm trained as a lawyer, I'm trained as a geographer, I'm trying to think about social and environmental communities. I am from Peru, and I try to think, even though I'm based in the United States right now, I try to think from Peru and try to think about how an agenda of of global relations and like transnational relations will better serve the people in the country. So something that I do want to highlight is that when doing comparative analysis, I would encourage to pay a clear attention to the specifics of place, because a transregional analysis and a comparative analysis that focuses on finding commonality often risks flattening difference and flattening specificity, and making our work further unimplementable if we don't pay attention to the specifics of place and the specific relations and the history of place. So something that has been brought up since the very start of our meeting today was the fact of the transatlantic slave trade and like colonialism. But like, for example, these roots thinking post-colonially do not look the same when you're thinking in Latin America, when you're thinking in Africa. So like flattening that difference actually would underserve the way that we're thinking of our own country's capacities and our own country's needs for development. So that's just one example of how we can start approaching, maybe thinking from like a post-colonial positionality into these relations that are current in 2024. So I echo Professor Pavitra's remarks when she mentioned that she does talk to her students, encouraging them to pay attention to domestic specificity and not necessarily commonality, because it does matter. And from like a geographical lens, it does matter what concepts we use to think concepts. And I would add too that it matters what relations we use to study relations. So like the idea, thinking back to this very productive time when there was a strong Pan-African collaboration between thinkers in Brazil, thinkers in Latin America, like Paulo Freire, Milton Santos, who were mentioned just now by Professor Paul Nantuya, like Frantz Fanon, like going back to like maybe how those relations of thought and how those relations of rethinking about the world were built might give us a different perspective that avoids flattening difference and just using the tools that we might, as interdisciplinary thinkers, we might have been developing in the last like 30 years, and avoid prescriptive thought that might lead to think about these issues as problems of securitization, problems of Cold Warism, problems that can only be solved with like developmental and developmentalism frameworks. So maybe like, so and this is where I want to land for this first part of like methodologies and concepts and relations. At least from my positionality, these are not the challenges of our time. The challenges that of thinking about like bipolar worlds, or thinking about securitization, or thinking about developmentalism are challenges that have long, I think, more critically been relegated to think about more about different ways that we can like relate to each other globally and relate to, particularly because we're thinking about climate change and we're thinking about environmental conservation, relate to each other, to different communities within our countries, and relate to nature. So I guess that's where I would start my call of like how do we think about building useful frameworks for the topics that are urgent for us right now, and topics that keep coming up, at least in Latin America, and from the work that I do, are topics of indigenous relations to nature, energy transition, extractivism, and like artisanal scale and like subsistence scale, fisheries, for example, that I think there's going to be one of you talking about, like illegal fisheries. So basically these like a lot of these issues I want to highlight too are issues of how our countries and how our populations or how our legal frameworks, if we want, have been relating to nature. And the fact that this stage of globalization and this like the growing pressure of climate change is putting increased pressure on these resources, the scarcity and the risk and the adaptation that our countries are going to have to prepare to. So what I'm noticing is that many times when we think about these things, our countries, and Peru especially, is put in positions that do not necessarily prioritize the goals of the country itself. In the case of the energy transition, for example, a lot of the discussions in Latin America are focused around the extraction of lithium, the lithium triangle, and basically continuing to position the region in the place that it has been traditionally put, which is an extractive site, and which is feeding into global agendas of mitigation or energy transition that are possibly not the priority for the region. And in that particular case of climate change, I want to focus, I want to use that as an example to think about when thinking about transnationalism, focusing on these contradictions. So I guess my proposal today is if we're going to think about transregionalism, or we're going to try to think specifically about place, let's focus on the contradictions that are making this situation so complex. And using the example of climate change, I want to focus on the contradiction between focusing so many of our efforts as a country, as a community, as a business sector into transitioning for green technologies and extracting resources for that, instead of focusing on adaptation, for example, and instead of focusing on mitigation in the terms that countries like mine, like Peru, should be prioritizing. And one of those big flashes right now, or big red flags right now, is the fact that the Amazon has had one of the worst years of forest fires this year. And it has to do with climate change. It has to do with desertification. It has to do with deforestation. It has to do with supply chains that go as far as the consumption of meat, and particularly who these the consumption of meat, the practices of farming, and our own local in-country property regimes. So I feel like when we start pulling on this thread, we find that maybe if we do want to talk about if we do want to talk about climate change, there are inherent contradictions in the way that our countries are relating, not only to each other and not only to the global market, but to themselves. And what I would suggest as a method, I'm going to try to end in a couple of minutes, because I do have to leave in 10. So maybe if there wants to be a conversation, I can leave about 10 minutes for conversation. So focusing on specificities of place and focusing on particular contradictions, and then looking at particular topics. I suggested climate change and thinking about mitigation versus adaptation, thinking about mitigation as energy transition versus forest conservation, or versus versus property regimes and preventing deforestation. There's a contradiction there where the same government is oftentimes feeding into two completely different agendas that are contradicting with itself. And why is it that this is possible? Why is it that in the name of development, both are possible? And maybe what we need to do is have a clear, our own countries would need to have a clear agenda of okay, what do we want to do? And think about these relations that we have towards nature and that we have towards animals, and and how they manifest in institutions, in extractivism, and prioritizing that. So I do think a lot through animals because of my work through animal law, and I guess that's how I frame it. But thinking about fish, for example, and thinking about fisheries, if we thought about how we relate to these species differently, or how we relate to the artisanal fisherman community in different parts of the country, we would find that there is inherent contradiction in those relations too. So I guess I'll wrap it up with that. And what I would suggest, I'm not encouraging us to find solutions right now. I'm just encouraging us to rethink relationships so that we can creatively create solutions. But one possible solution that I can think about is just modeling. So thinking about if we did put more stress, because the relationship with China, because of China's inherent demand and capabilities to transform and consume all these natural resource products that we export. So because the relationship with China will inherently put more pressure on the systems that we already have in place, what does the future look like when we model the same relationships that we have right now with an increased demand? Is that sustainable? And is that something that is inherent to China, or is that something that is inherent to the relationships and the frameworks that we have built in our countries? And that we very much, and I'm talking as a Peruvian, as someone who has worked for the government, someone who was taught in there, but that's why I say we, but thinking about whether the relations that we have built would be able to withstand that pressure, and encourage us as a community to think inwards instead of thinking outwards when we start developing solutions or when we start developing possibilities for the future. So I'll end it there with some short remarks, and I hope to hear from you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Monica. It's a challenge for us, I think so, how to think deeply about you to share with us about the relationship between the nature and human being as a society, but also related to the political power, how to rethink our relationship with the nation, right? And especially because the president of China create this kind of challenge, because we don't have the control to address our concerns or our interests in this kind of asymmetric relationship, thinking Africa, China, or Latin America and China. I don't know if someone has some questions or comments. Please raise your hand, because we can take advantage of at least 5 minutes to continue talking with Monica. Someone? Maria? No?
Thank you. Yes, I couldn't find my my hand down there.
No
Too
worry.
many reactions now. Thank you, Monica. I find that what you present is very interesting and challenging. So I was thinking if you could maybe think of like 3 main aspects we should maybe prioritize regarding, because what you present is a very, very complex scenario. And I think that, at least as far as I know, there's not a clear plan of where to go or how to go. So what are the, like, if you could have to say maybe 2 or 3 things that we should actually focus on to think through this, and maybe with a possibility of a solution. I don't dare say that, but of a plan.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And Percival,
Yeah.
please go ahead, and then you can answer, Monica. Percival? We cannot hear you. Okay.
Yeah, there we go. No, thank you, Cesar and Monica for your presentation. More than a question, it's also a comment, and you can fit it into your presentation and answer to Maria's question. Well, first of all, I couldn't agree more. Even being I'm originally from Venezuela, and my area of focus is China-Venezuela relations. And usually when you talk about China as a challenge, as a problem, as an opportunity, as a X, it's usually viewed, as you mentioned, traditionally from the outside in. It's how do you adapt to these challenges, and rarely do we see that this is, in my view, something more about us, our system of governance, our laws, our model of development. Yes, I'm sure China will, precisely because of what you mentioned, for growing involvement in extractive industries, and that's definitely not going to change. So focus on projections, and I think would definitely help. But again, China, as before that, the United States and Europe and other extractive countries that have extractive industries in our region. At the end of the day, it's in our territory, so it's our responsibility. And a lot of these conversations tend to focus on blaming those foreign actors, when in reality, it's our responsibility, and also in our hands to solve the kind of issues. So an over focus on China, or China as an area of study, while I think does help and contributes to the conversation, it's more about inward looking. But I'll leave it up to there.
Thank you, Percival. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Monica.
thank you. Okay, yeah. Thank you, Percival. Thank you, Maria, for your questions and comments. And so to think with Maria's question. It's like, we all love, I feel like we all love, we all would love to have, oh, this is a recipe and this is definitely going to work. So I'm encouraging and trying to train myself not to, coming from law, it's always like, oh, you have like this is what we should do. So I will start to say, like, just embrace uncertainty and see what's happening, but then maybe one remedy that is easier and one remedy that is harder. So like one that is easier, I would say, like, let's think of thresholds. Let's take stock of where we are and what we need as a country. So like, what are our goals? What are our development goals? We have like 2030, like los ODSs, and like, so like we what are our development goals and what do we need to get there? And then maybe just work towards that, because if we, as say, like the king of Peru, there's not a king, it's a president, but like if like the one person that had to take, as if it was one person that was taking this decisions, but if the one person that has to take the decision of how we are going to organize as a nation is taking decisions that are inherently unsustainable in the long term, then like take stock earlier on to meet what are these thresholds, and like where is there space to allow for more, like where is there space to allow for growth, and then what kind of growth is the growth that we need, and like is it growth or is it like redistribution, is it like a smarter way of administering resources, do we need more technology, but not necessarily just, I feel like what our government continues to do is just fit themselves within like a global agenda or within like a stronger agenda. And what that does is like underserve the communities within the country. So I would say taking stock and working through thresholds, and the model of thresholds in climate change and like in human environmental systems is a threshold that I'm thinking with. Like climate change is managed a lot about thinking about stocks, thinking about particular gases and everything, and how the atmosphere can take them, or how much trees we need, or how much like how do we measure soil. So that's one way that is really prescriptive and I don't love, but I think would be a way of starting that. And then the other that I think is harder, and I would see where we get with that, is maybe stop, like, let's not, what would it look like if we got rid of, in our imagination, of the nation state as a unity, and if we stopped thinking as like the national territory as like the one space where there are trade-offs, and you extract from some place to give to the other, and then even out economic growth, or even out like access to health or any other measures that you're using. And if we started thinking maybe with nature, like since we're going to depend so much of nature and extractivism, if we started to think and actually manage territory with the unique relationships that are possible and that exist within different ecosystems. So, and not using it as a trade-off, which is the model that we currently have and that we also have in climate change. But if we didn't think of the nation state as a unit, and also we didn't feed into this idea that we can actually even out inequality as a nation, because that will inherent, like that creates the idea that we do have an inherently shared experience of like what the outward relationship is like. It doesn't really help us take stock of what the inward relationship is like within the regional population. And again, I'm trying to think from Peru, and I'm trying to think about like from the inherent inequalities that are also geographically and ecologically distributed through the whole country. So what would happen if we, instead of thinking about evening out all these, the whole country, we did things specifically, and not in political regions, but more on like geographical regions. And I think that could start us to prepare for risk, and that could start us to prepare for like inherent physical risk that comes with climate change, and also to take stock of what are the actual resources that we can work with. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it there. And thank you so much for your questions and your time. And I look forward to seeing you later after I'm done teaching my class.
Thank you, Monica.
Okay,
I think
bye.
you share this frame that we are going to discuss during the next 1 hour. So before we continue with other two speakers, I want to share just to learn what Monica introduced us. So can you see my PowerPoint? Yeah, can you see that?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I mean, in Latin America, the presence of Chinese investment is very consolidating. And we need, as Monica said, maybe we need to get some learn lesson from Chinese presence in Latin America. And I think that one case is very important is the Chancay port in Peru. I mean, this port is gonna inaugurate in 2 weeks in the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation meeting in Lima. The Chinese president then is gonna do that, and the idea how to connect obviously the whole commodities and the whole resources that Latin America, South America has to the Asian side. And I think that's very important because it's not a good opportunity, as Monica said, for our economies, but also comes to some challenge and some environmental and social probable impacts to for example, the Amazon rainforest. You can see, for example, that there are at least 2 routes, one option in the middle of the country and the other in the south. And we can see that I don't know, in the last 15 years, there are some other routes that Peru and Brazil built in the past. And then increase the illegal economies, increase the deforestation, increase obviously the drug dealers and illegal mining operation, illegal logging. I don't want to put in details that, but obviously produce environmental social impact, because when you build this kind of routes in fragile ecosystems without presence of the governments or the authorities, you also generate this kind of terrible impacts. For example, prostitution, slavery, and obviously this is a risk that our national governments or Chinese legal regulation have not considered, because they consider just the direct impact of these projects, but not the indirect impact, for example, the migrations and this illegal operation around to the roads. Just an example, because Peruvian government, Brazilian government, and Chinese government consider to build this road to connect the Chancay port to the Pacific side, crossing the Amazon rainforest. Well, in one of these roads, in the last 2 years, drug dealers built the aircraft landing strips, like a small airports. You can see this road very, very close to these polygons of the communities, of indigenous communities, to transport cocaine. So, I mean, my point is that when we consider the regulations, especially because in Latin America there is like an run a race to the bottom to flexibilize the environmental regulation, the social regulations, to facilitate the projects, especially the extractive projects. And I mean, we saw the interest of China in the extractive sector, for example, in Peru, or oil and gas sector in Venezuela and Ecuador, or electricity and infrastructure sector in Brazil. Well, it's important to understand not just the direct impact, but also the indirect impacts, and also the governance of natural resources as a frame to rule all these operations, to rule also the relationship between China and Latin America countries, and obviously in Africa countries too. Just to add what Monica shared with us. So we can continue with the second speakers. Kenny Manduna, he's one of the postdoctoral fellows of the International Research Group of the Rosa Luxemburgo Stiftung. He's right now in University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. So, Kenny, go ahead. You have 50 minutes to share your presentation. Can you hear?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, go ahead, Kenny.
Thank you so much. Can I share my presentation?
Can you share your presentation or not?
Yeah, I'm sharing.
Okay, cool.
Can you confirm if you're seeing something
Yeah.
now?
Wait.
Okay.
Not yet. Yeah, okay. We can see you.
You can see it in presentation mode, right?
Yeah, we can see you.
I mean, like my slides, you can see them.
Yes, they're in presentation mode.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So my presentation centers around the new scramble for African critical minerals between the major powers at the moment. And to say who is winning, who is losing. To what extent, like the interests of the Africans are also protected and respected. Where is the African agent, the African voice in all these huge developments, huge massive investments in critical minerals and also in renewable energy mega projects, especially in SADC region, in the Southern African part of the world. And like the geopolitical competitions we are seeing like taking place at the moment, who is losing, who is not losing, how Africans are being pivoted, and like also issues around like the environmental governance and social impact when it comes to assessing the impact of this investment, the competitions geopolitically, etc. So I just want to draw your attention to the fact that the role of African minerals, especially the green minerals. In fact, we, like the African Union, deliberately called them green minerals, not strategic or critical minerals like what the rest of the world are calling them. For one reason, because we are saying who is calling them critical, we are questioning the integrity of the criticality of those minerals, like the whole world is calling critical. Because what they are saying is, you find countries like Botswana, their economies like does rely more on diamond. The meaning of which is diamond is more critical to Botswana than anything else. Lithium cannot be more critical to Botswana than diamond is to the economy, or in fact, like to their livelihood, like even the economy itself. So what we have learned from the IMF report that was last March, it says more than 30% of the proven critical minerals deposited in the world, they are found in Africa. And a lot of them, they are found in the sub-Saharan Africa. So you cannot overemphasize the importance of African critical minerals when it comes to transitioning to clean energy. So that's also the reason why we are having a lot of geopolitical competitions. We are calling the new scramble of Africa carving out the way it did back in the day in 1884 and 1885 in Berlin. So now you can see the geological bound of the continent and the share when it comes to global reserves and also the production. We go to cobalt, DRC, South Africa, and Zambia, and like in Madagascar, they have more than 50% of the global reserves. Green hydrogen, you talk of Zimbabwe, Namibia, and South Africa. Lithium as well. Zimbabwe is Zimbabwe is the biggest reserve in the continent and number 5 or number 6 in the world. So this is the criticality of Africa when it comes to where we are at the moment, when it comes to how we can transition to green energy. So now we are at a critical juncture in the of course, at the world at large and also in Africa in particular. Why is it that if you had to look at it now, like the geopolitical competition between the US and China is being to do with the supply chains of these minerals and also the control and ownership of the technology of these green minerals. It's happening at the time when African countries, especially Southern African countries, they are keeping on discovering many of these critical minerals. If you go to Zimbabwe now, almost every district in the country, about 61 districts, they have discovered a lithium deposit. So the question now is, how are we supposed to either benefit or speak on our own? So I'm asking this question to say, who stand to gain and lose in the new scramble of Africa? And are African critical minerals capable of strategically negotiating these win-win deals? I'm asking the questions to say, do we have the expertise when it comes to negotiating at the global level in a way that we are pivoting African interests first, or we are recentering in African in our negotiations, in our deals, in our agreements, in our MOUs? The African agents in all this, are we seeing it or something else? So if I can dive into the demand of the critical minerals, like at the moment, vis-a-vis like around 2050, the critical minerals Africa has are the ones which are which are going to be in high demand in around 2050. If you to check 418% increase in lithium, what does it mean? African lithium producing countries, Zimbabwe, Zambia, DRC, Namibia, they are going to be at the spotlight. You go to aluminum, you go to manganese, you go to graphite in Mozambique. All of them, we are witnessing like a huge increase when it comes to the demand going forward. So what does it mean? In our context, we are now saying we need to see how in Africa it's going to be recentered. This one, I just want also to draw attention on the fact that the extraction of a mineral, this strategic mineral, when it comes to value, it is only 0.6% of the global, of the entire value chain. So if you mine cobalt in DRC, just mine and export it to China or somewhere else, you are getting 0.6% of the aggregate value of the mineral. I mean, like after it being turned into the, say, electrical vehicle battery. If you are to do smelting and refining at the first grade level or second grade level, you are only going to just above 1%. So what does it mean now? More than 90% of the value of the African critical minerals are being enjoyed outside the continent. And one other thing also, globally, more than 54% of the proven deposits of these traditional minerals are found either near or on the lands owned by the indigenous people. So now the issues around their rights, the issues around to say, do they have the right to say no to displacement? Do they have the right to say no to mining activities? Them offering their consent, like to what extent are we witnessing that? And to what extent also our government in the developing world are also collaborating with the big business from the global north in a way that is not going to also make the indigenous people particularly benefit from their minerals as well. So what is the new scrap of Africa? How it is, like how the permutations and the dynamics of the scramble are unfolding. If you had to look at it now, the only thing which has changed is an African is now part of the negotiation, or is now part of the of the Berlin Conference or the Congo Conference. Back in the day, they were not part of it. So if you look at FOCAC, TICAD, like those summits like happening in Italy and Germany, all of them, we are seeing our African leaders being called, come please and what? And then we have our MOUs or our conference or our cooperations. But what is at the center of these conferences or these summits? It is the critical minerals everywhere else you go. But then the question we are also like asking is, you go to South Korea or you go to Italy. Italy, when it comes to even Germany, the land size, it is smaller than Zimbabwe, but all the leaders in the continent, they are flocking to that. So the issue is, how are we pivoting ourselves? So in a way, we are seeing that deja vu feeling of the Berlin Conference like replaying itself, and you can easily tell to say it can what. It can also project like the horrors of the scramble and the partition of Africa. So now, if you had to look at it, the most interesting part is China is a huge grip in African extractive industry. In a way that like EU and America, even Canada and Australia, they are kind of playing a second fiddle role to try to catch up. For example, in Zimbabwe, China is the biggest foreign investor to the point that it is estimated it controls more than 90% of the Zimbabwean industry, like Zimbabwean mining industry. It is so huge. And in Zimbabwe, we are talking of a country with more than 60 base minerals. 40 of them are being exploited. One of them are like one of them being what? Lithium. And at the moment now, the 4 strategic biggest lithium mining companies in Zimbabwe, it's either in part, say 87% or 100% owned by Chinese, right? Then now, what we are also seeing is the rehabilitation of the Tazara Railway corridor. I think like you get it like being spoken by Professor Wekesa. Zambia, Tanzania railway line, it was very old. So like in a way it was not being used. So now they are now rehabilitating it. For what reason? That which like I was talking about to say the scale of Africa, like the reason being they wanted to transport in an easy way raw materials from the we call it the Central Copper Belt region, DRC and Zambia, where there's copper, cobalt, lithium, and many other critical minerals. But are they going to process them? The issue is to make sure there is a safe, easy way of transporting those minerals from that copper belt region to the Indian Ocean, then go to China. You look in Zambia and DRC at the moment, 41% of cobalt production and of 61% of lithium production and 28% of lithium, of copper production in both countries, owned and controlled by the Chinese. Then in DRC, Manono lithium mine is one of the biggest in the world, owned 15% by the Chinese and then 75% by Australia. Sorry. Then in Mozambique as well, graphite. Mozambique is one of the biggest reserve of this, of graphite. 70% stake. It's non-Mozambican, of course, like the Australians. You go to Namibia, it's one of the lithium producing countries owned by the Chinese. So what is the like if you had to say now how China is dominating the world when it comes to critical minerals, especially like lithium, you can see the ownership stake across the world. 50%, 60, 100, 70. So in a way, they control number one, the means of extraction and also technology as well. So yeah, they've got like an upper end. In Zimbabwe, I just want to like show you like a lot, like what I was saying, to say almost every part of the country they are discovering like lithium deposits. And if you have to look at it closely, many of the companies mining in those spots are mostly Chinese companies with more than 60 to 80% ownership and control. And this what. But then now we need now to say what is the Western response to that Chinese strategic huge grip in the region. They are by all means trying to say how can we displace the ownership, the control, the management of these minerals from the Chinese to the Western like powers. But now, if I can say this now before I explain this, China is enjoying strategic advantages over the Western powers. Why? Even if the Chinese are known for, like in the continent, of course, like not in China, for not being respectful of the environmental issues. What they are, like their strategic advantage is they are leveraging on their history with African countries during the decolonization period. They are the ones who also helped the project. They trained the comrades, they also gave them a lot of support in terms of military support or even financial support back in the day when they were trying, like when African national liberation movement were trying to decolonize like their country. So China is being seen as an all-weather friend. Right now, even the debt condition they are giving are not as stringent as from the World Bank or IMF. So in a way, China is kind of a preferred partner when it comes to what. So now the Western countries now are now trying to come and say, how can we also gain like the strategy? So one of the way, it's a 1 billion euro 2023 Brussels EU Namibia business partnership. For what reason? Green hydrogen. Namibia, by the way, is one of the biggest deposits of the what of green hydrogen. So now they also want to make sure that they also benefit from it. So it's a 1 billion euro. Then number two, a 2.2 billion US dollars to do what? To renovate the Lobito railway line. This one now runs from Zambia into DRC, going to Angola to the port of Lobito. But for what reason now? So if you have to contrast it with the Tazara corridor I was talking about, this one is also coming from the Central Copper Belt. So we have the one going to the Atlantic Ocean, the other one going to the Indian Ocean. But to do what? We call it like from the pit to the pot, unprocessed the raw ores just going without any interruption to the what? To the sea via these railway corridors. And you can easily tell like they are hugely funded because it is gonna put either China or even the West at a very what strategic. EU has got a lot of agreements with Zambia individually and DRC individually as well, and also DRC and Zambia at the same time. US as well has got also another other agreement with the two countries. The other one to do with centralizing the manufacturing of electrical vehicle like batteries in both countries, although it hasn't like taken off at the moment. In like they also have another strategic MOU with Rwanda. Even Rwanda doesn't produce and like doesn't have any critical mineral. The issue is about the geopolitics. It's very close to what the DRC, the eastern part of the like of the Congo, where these critical minerals are. And what we are also seeing now is Britain is considering towing the decades-long Western relations with Zimbabwe. Why? They are now saying, no, we also need the lithium, but so it's one of the, and the US, they are beginning to terminate like the more than 20 old sanctioned program. We are also seeing in Tanzania, the US firm for lithium as well. Then now, see the Chinese and the Western legal and policy frameworks to make sure that, like, when they are to come to Africa, they've got a very clear plan to say how are we going to extract and export. In like the EU, like they do have like the net zero industry act to scale up the manufacturing of clean technologies in the EU. So it's a clear plan to say we need to do this. So we need now to go where we can find those minerals. So they need to go to resource countries. US Inflation Reduction Act is a 369 billion for the to incentivize green technologies and climate programs. But then also, where are you going to get the resources? You need to go to Africa, where they say 30% of the global reserves are there. EU's Green Deal Plan, EU's Critical Materials Act as well. And now we are seeing the reauthorization of African Growth and Opportunity Act. It was supposed to expire in 2025 next year, but now it is being reauthorized. For what reason? To make sure that like the trade between US and Africa with critical minerals must be expanded and also like extended. And they made in China 2025 a 2015 framework for China. By 2015, it was a 300 billion. Look in 20 like just after COVID, 1.4 trillion US dollars. So in a way, they are increasing the ante of their investment, of their to make sure that like they are always at the frontier of technology. But then now that is what makes now resource countries very important for them, and because all of them they do have clear plans. What the meaning of which is what there is going to be huge geopolitical competition when it comes to sourcing these minerals. So this is like the demand as well. So yeah, I just want like to show you the Lobito corridor and the Tazara corridor. Like what I have said, Tazara corridor, it's from Zambia to Tanzania to the port of like in Dar es Salaam, going to the Indian Ocean. Then Lobito, Zambia, DRC, then Angola. So this is where like the geopolitics is being fought. And the question I'm always asking is to say, where is the African agent in all this? How are we participating in either losing or benefiting from all this, right? So now when it comes to my recommendations now, what are we supposed to be doing, or what are we supposed to be telling those great powers which are busy trying to milk our resources? What should we do, or what are they supposed to be doing when they come to Africa? So now, one way is to advocate for the amendment of the WTO regulations on resource nationalism and for free and fair trade. The example, which is very pertinent, it's for Indonesia. Indonesia tried to come up with a resource nationalistic policy. That was, I think, 2019, 2018, I think, or 2021. And the EU had to file a case against Indonesia to say, according to the quantitative import and the export restrictions, you cannot limit those ores you are like selling to us according to the WTO regulations. And Indonesia, they lost the case, right? So in a way now, the advocates for changing these regulations, because they are not pro-sourcing countries, which are primarily like developing countries. It must be what? It must be done. That's the reason why now at the moment, African desk at WTO, they are now talking about local content, subsidy, and also like technology like transfer, which is, and it is being supported by China, India, and Indonesia. Because you know, like especially like Indonesia, it is part of the victims of what? Of such a draconian legislation at the WTO. We are also like advocating for building like regional clusters for selected critical minerals. I think like comrades from Latin America, the lithium triangle, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, it's one of the perfect kind of a regional cluster we would want to see, say maybe in Southern Africa, to say you combine Zimbabwe and South Africa, PGMs, platinum group minerals, you are going to have more than 90% of the global reserves of that. And it is a critical mineral in itself. So why can't we build a regional cluster and make sure that like we either determine the price or even like the beneficiation or the supply chain? We do the same with the lithium, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, DRC, Zambia, and Namibia. We do the same like with all other critical minerals we have in the continent. And I think if you are to do that, we will go a long way in making Africa a role maker when it comes to these debates around how we can transition to what? To clean energy, rather than a point where we are at the moment where we are root takers. And we can also stop that extractivist mining way they are using from the pit to the pot. When we are now saying, let's make sure that every stage of the value chain is supposed to be conducted like in the source countries. Or if we say those regional clusters we can create, say maybe Zimbabwe, Namibia, and DRC and Zambia with lithium, we can find a centralized place where we can say this is like the final point. So that is going to give African what? Like African, like the voice, that agent, we say it has been eroded. And also striking a balancing act between resource nationalism and the need to attract the working like foreign direct investment. Because if we are not to strike a balancing act between the two, we will suffer the waste of both at the same time. Because you will find a situation whereby, like for example, at the moment, many of the mining companies are owned by non-Africans. And what is the consequent result of that? Of course, it's a reverse case. It's the abandoned and underdevelopment happening at the same time. That I like that irony. Also issues around the criticality of critical minerals. Who is calling them critical? So why can't we make it a relative phraseology to say, if diamond is critical to Botswana, let it be called critical by its people from that country, not to say the whole world or like the whole continent must go lithium critical when other countries don't have that particular mineral. And the other thing also, which is very problematic at the moment, we are talking about value addition, beneficiation of these minerals. But then if you don't own the mining claims, the mining rights are owned by non-locals, whose minerals are you going to beneficiate? The minerals are no longer yours. So even if you benefit them, it's not going to make a huge impact in terms of development, right? Also, we need like a team of experts to negotiate the deals. For example, like to adopt the China-Indonesian model, where processing plants are being put in place in Indonesia. Zimbabwe, I think, is one of the case studies where the biggest 4 lithium companies, they now have processing plants on site, because by 2022, government banned the exportation of raw lithium. So every company was forced to come up with a processing plant on site. Then we also need to regularize and formalize like the artisanal mining and to have clear empowerment policies. Like what we say now is, what is clear at the moment is how FDI is supposed to come to the continent, and also how we are supposed to displace those indigenous people who are either on or close to where we are discovering like this mine. But when it comes to empowering them now, there's no clarity. So we need consistent and sustainable and clear policies when it comes to say, how are we going to empower them? Then a new strategic like partnership to favor resource-rich countries, not resource importing. Yeah, so if you are to see now, there are a lot of MOUs, agreements, which are not binding and enforceable. For example, like the one I was talking about between the EU and the US with either DRC or Rwanda or Zambia, they're not enforceable, they're not binding. So any country can just think of what, of just say, no, we are no longer capable of maintaining our commitment to that. So why can't we make them binding? To say, once we sign, and if it is signed in support of African interests, then it is supposed to go by. And then now to the Chinese, to the EU, and also the US, what are we also advocating? Fair and ecological exchange with Africa, and the effective planning of post-mining landscape, land use and economies. Because at the moment, if you had to look at it like there are a lot of environmental degradations. You know, the paradox is these countries in their own countries, right? They make sure that it is a punishable offense to destroy an environment without a post-mining landscape plan, without a post-mining land use plan or post-mining economic plan. But when they come to the continent, they do whatever they want. And I think also that's the reason why there is a huge geopolitical competition, because it's very easy to do it without stringent rules and regulations. So that's what we also want from them to say, when you are coming to the continent, make sure you have these plans in place before we want. And also ecological reparations. They can also take the form of climate change reparations, but also to do with how they degraded the land during mining and all those ones. Then responsible and sustainable and inclusive mining approaches, which really like support the commitment of the ESG. They're also supposed to be given priority as well. Then putting Africans at the center of contemporary mining policies. Also, when it comes to displacement, because like what I've said, say the case of Zimbabwe, where they keep on discovering like lithium everywhere in the district. Compensation must be fair, must be adequate, must be just. People must be consulted to establish if they do have the right to say no, if they don't want to like to move, or if they are to also contribute to the extent to which they also need the compensation, the amount, and the way they have to be compensated. And also commitment to research and the innovation in the technology transfer. It's also one fundamental recommendation. I think if they are to come with such commitment, it is going to go a long way to give an African voice and also agency. Thank you so much. These are some of the further things.
Thank you, Kenny, for your comprehensive presentation. I think that the challenge in Africa or Latin America is how to define our own perspective about energy transition, independently from China or the global north, even the private sector too. I see that is Chile and Colombia has their own regulation on that, regulating critical minerals, renewable energy, and how to reduce fossil fuels. It's very, at least there are some polemics on that, but I think that is one path to other countries can follow together. No? So Leland told me that we haven't even been able to contact our third speaker. So we have time to share your thoughts, your questions or comments, at least for the next 10, 20 minutes. So the floor is yours. I don't know who wants to start first. No, who want to say something?
Oh, I'll go first.
Okay, Byron. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Kennedy, for the very comprehensive and data rich presentation. And so in one of your earlier slides, you suggested the win-win solution, right? And so I'm wondering what, because the policy recommendations, I think some of the win-win part for the African countries who are involved in these negotiations are embedded in that but and I noticed that there were some policy recommendations that were in green, and I don't know whether the color suggested something, but what would the win-win look like for African countries who are dealing with these China, US, and in terms of the sort of mineral extraction? What would you hope to see in the negotiation on the African side to ensure that it's a win-win?
Okay. Thank you very much, like, for the very good question. What I would think, of course, I will be biased because the 5 centuries of plunder and looting in the continent by the West, so how I would want, or like the measure, I would say if this is there, then I can say this is a win-win situation. Or like if I say if I see A, B, C, D in these deals or in this engagement, then I say Africans are benefiting. My starting point always is the extent to which Africans are either allowed or are demanding to own, to manage, and to control both the means and factors of production, factors of like extraction, value addition, either exportation, distribution, even just any transition itself. To what extent are we being involved in ownership, in control, in management, right? So for me, if that happens, to say people from DRC now, where we get more than 70% of our cobalt globally, 80% of the cobalt mining or extraction or even like exportation is now being owned by the Congolese. For me, that is the one metric I can say, if that is the case, then it makes more sense. Then number two, the issue of finishing off all the stages of the value addition of, say, we are now coming up with the electrical batteries, right? Like electrical car, like batteries, say in like what they are trying to carve out in DRC and Zambia. If every stage is now being conducted in the continent, you know why it is more important? We are going to create a lot of jobs, directly and also indirectly. The upstream and downstream, people are going to benefit if we are to do all those things in the continent. But like once we say from the pit to the pot, what are we doing? We are exporting not only the value of our minerals, like what I have said, to say you export as a raw lithium. What are you what are you gaining? You are gaining less than 1% of the aggregate value. So you are exporting not only the value of your mineral, but also jobs. So once we say we are now beneficiating, we are now value adding, while we are in the continent, for me, it's also one another metric to say that's a win-win situation. Of which, of course, I know it's a huge mountain to climb when you have to say do that in the continent when you are negotiating with these big powers, because they also want to create jobs, to do all those things in their own quarters. But I think if we are to try to do that, like why I was giving the case of Zimbabwe compelled lithium producing countries, like companies, which are mostly Chinese, to say you need to set up a processing plant on site. Now, one of the companies is now processing the lithium ore into second grade lithium concentrate. The other 3 or 2, they are still doing it at first grade. So at least you are moving up value there, you are moving up with what? With the, in the value chain, to say at least we are now doing this. So I think if many African countries will borrow a leaf from that kind of a situation, it is going to go along.
Thank you, Kenny. I don't know if someone wants to ask Kenny. Thank you, Valerie. Because it's not, I have a question. I am a little surprised, Kenny, in your presentation. I think that you haven't mentioned about the governance challenges, because I was part of the ITI International Board representing civil society, and a big group of African countries were part of the EITI, and there are some challenges related to transparency issues, the opacity of the operations. Obviously, the lack of transparency can generate corruption. So even in the energy transition, what you propose, that I totally agree. I think that the main challenge for our country, not just from African countries, also, but also in Latin America, we have the problem of the corruption, the opacity, of the extractive sector. This is one legacy. In the last, I don't know, 2 decades, we saw many cases related to that. I remember there was some cases in Senegal, DRC, among other countries, where there are some bribes, and obviously that affects how to get some revenues from the extractive sector, and obviously to share the benefit to the population, to the whole country. So what do you think about that? How to handle that in the energy transition? Because it's a huge opportunity to raise that problematic and to get a new, I don't know, a new consensus about that, to improve our regulation, to improve how to manage our resources, and independently from the global north or from China, and get this opportunity to improve how to get some benefit from the energy transition.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, which I think is also meritorious and very pertinent. What I want to say is the existence of lack of clarity, lack of consistency, and also of those corruption scandals, like in many African countries. It is a huge infrastructure for the superpowers to come and get those minerals just for a song, if I can say this. So to answer you now, it is going to go a long way in making sure that African benefit if we are to plug those walls. And if we are to look at it now, we are now revising the African mining vision. It was formulated in 2009. And since then, it was not it didn't take much of traction. But now we are now talking of what? Of revising it, because it talks about beneficiation, strong institutions, sustainable mining, responsible mining, right? And the Africans being at the center of extraction of our resources. So this is what we are also talking about. And in a way, the document is talking about strong and effective institutions. That way, yeah, it is going to go a long way. But then where we are at the moment, with of course huge corruption, of course, and also like weak institutions, leakages, smuggling of these minerals, and a big artisanal and small scale sector which is not regulated. Like in many countries, they are informal and illegal, but they are doing business. So in a way, you can also find them being part of a huge network in the country, like with those big, powerful people, either in politics, in business, or in bureaucracy. So yeah, I want to believe it is going to go a long way if we are to plug those holes in making Africans benefit from the transition itself. Yes.
No, thank you, Kenny. I mean, we can continue talking about that. About, for example, the very challenge is the constraint of civic space in many regions, not just in Africa, but also in Latin America. There are some limitations to the public participation, to get information from the government, from the companies. We are living that in Peru, in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela as well. I think that in Africa countries, there are the same challenge, how to abroad the participation of the citizenship of the citizens in the extractive sector, and now in the energy transition. So we have to frame at least to improve the current frame of participation. If not, these new deals, we are not be part of that. No, so it's a challenge. So I don't know if someone wants to ask or comments or or say something else. I don't know. There are some colleagues from Latin America. Maria, Percival, Maria. Go ahead.
Okay, Cesar, I feel you pointed at me. Now, I just wanted to say I find it very interesting. And I was just wondering, it's only maybe a reflection, but maybe I would like to know what Kennedy can say about this. Is that you talk about Africa, and we talk a lot about Latin America, but then internally we see many difficulties or challenges for collaboration within countries and to actually make it work. So in terms of like case studies and maybe also like building a bit on the question for Mónica earlier, like where do you see that are opportunities for actually engaging in a like broader maybe collaboration? I do think international institutions play a very important role. The UN's paper, for example, on critical minerals. I don't know if you've seen that recommendations. It's yeah. I find it interesting in terms of like what we can actually use for local regulations. But I wonder if there's any like success case study that or case that you could maybe comment upon, because it's something that we've been thinking a lot here in Latin America. And we all speak the same language in Latin America. I mean, or two languages, we can all mostly speak two languages. So that also helps. But then at the same time, we have a history of a very difficult internal collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What I would want to say on that critical question in Africa is that it is a very, very old question. And it attracted a lot of contradictions. In fact, I can call it like a very intractable question because since during decolonization period, our Pan-Africanists like the comrades Nkuruma, Nyerere, they don't like they didn't agree on the pathway to say which one should we follow. They grouped themselves in two groups. The first one called the Casablanca group, Kwame Nkrumah was leading. Then the other one, the Monrovia group, Nyerere was leading. Kwame Nkrumah was talking about like Africa is a war, to say we need to liberate each and every part of the continent, and then make sure that like we have got a centralized government order somewhere else like in the continent. But then Nyerere was like, no, it can't work. We have to go by what we call the brick by brick. Every state on its own, they come up with their own independence. And maybe if we are to evolve to a point where we can integrate, then we can come up with a continental unity. So like to answer your question now, the cases of regional integration or like internal collaboration, like between countries, among countries in the continent, it's very difficult. Number one, like the language thing is also like an issue. We have former Portuguese colonies, former British colonies, former German colonies, former French colonies, right? If you like, do you know it's very much possible for me to go to Europe and speak with everyone else I can meet in English? But if I go up the north, so like for example, now I'm in Nairobi, you don't hear anyone speaking anything else you can hear. So like language differentiation is also a huge stumbling block when it comes to collaboration. They can do it at government level, but when you want to do it at civil society level or like person to person, it's very difficult because of language as well. And also the competition between and among countries when it comes to these minerals, because for example, I was talking about say lithium in Zimbabwe, in Namibia, in DRC, in Zambia, right? What does that mean? These four countries will be competing to say we can offer you like lesser price than the next country. So because of that, now we also don't agree. I want to give you like an example of where it should have worked, but it is not working. Zimbabwe and Zambia, they share a border, and they are separated by a river, like a Zambezi River. That is where we get most of our electricity from the Kariba Dam. So now, because of El Nino, and the water levels are so so low. So my colleague from Zambia was telling me to say, can you know what? There's no way these two countries can work together without having a joint government body of the Zambia's hydroelectric power. But they don't talk to each other because one country aligned with like with the east, the other one with the west, and because of that now it won't work to get it. So the regional and also the geopolitical tensions between these countries, they also make it very difficult to collaborate as well. So yeah, it's I don't want to lie. I don't have a case like a success story case where I can say Mozambique and Tanzania they collaborated and it is working. I don't have that.
Okay, well, I think that we just will have 3 minutes. I don't know if someone wants to say something else. If not, I think we have to close the session. Okay, thank you, Kenny and Monica, the speakers that we have, and I think that we have a lot of, I don't know, ideas, thoughts to share about learn lessons about the extractivist model that we have in our regions, and also, I don't know, maybe to identify these common opportunities, challenges, and difficulties of the energy transition. I think that we have a lot of information to share and to at least to progress in our relationship between China, Africa, and Latin America region. And I'm gonna send us ideas to Leland to get and at least to consider for the next discussions in this forum. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your patience, and I think that we have to return back in 1 hour and a quarter. So see you in 1 hour. Bye bye.